Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Standards Committee. As you know, we are currently in the period of Ramadan, so some councillors will wish to open their fast at the appropriate time, which this evening will be 6:19. So the meeting will be paused ahead of that for a 10-minute or so break so that members who need to do so, or may wish to do so, can open their fast and pray. There is food and water provided outside of fruit and water provided outside the council chamber. Right, so members and officers in attendance, please remember to switch your microphones on when speaking and speak directly into the microphone and switch it off when finished. Reporting officers joining via Teams. I don't think we've got any this evening though, do we?
No, Chair.
Perfect. So if you are joining via Teams, switch your camera microphone on when speaking, off when finished. This meeting this evening will be live streamed and a recording of the meeting will be available on the Council's website within 24 hours of the meeting. Any exempt items on the agenda at paragraph 14, the Chair will move the Local Government Act 1972 for the meeting to go into private and the live stream will be stopped. There may be a short delay before taking those items. Right, so let's get going. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Yes, Chair, we have received apologies from Mr. S. Bullock, independent member.
Okay, lovely. And we'll move on to the minutes. Has everyone read the minutes of the last meeting? Does anyone have any questions on the minutes of the last meeting? No? Any comments? Is the committee happy for me to sign as an accurate record? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so we've got Section 106 of the Local Government Finance Act. Those items on the agenda affected by Section 106 will be identified at the meeting. Any members so affected are reminded that he or she should disclose the fact and refrain from voting on those items. So do we have any disclosure of interest?
Not at this point, Chair.
Lovely. Any urgent business?
No urgent business, Chair.
Perfect. So let's move on to reports. So we've got over to Mark. We're going to talk about members' attendance at committee meetings.
Thank you, Chair. This report gives us a response to the committee's request at its last meeting to find out how other councils deal with the reporting of member attendance at committee meetings. And the committee will recall that we here in Luton prepare an annual report on members' attendance, which is included as an appendix to the Chair of Standards Committee's annual report. So we went out to a number of councils, and those who responded to our request for information are set out at paragraph 4 of the report. And it can be seen that there is a variety of practices in relation to the reporting of members' attendance. Some do not bother to do it at all in the form that we do it, but really let people just go into the whatever committee management information system they use and find out for themselves, which is okay. If you're interested in the attendance of a particular councillor, you will be able to go into that councillor's record and see it. But it's not particularly helpful if you're interested in what's happening overall. Some councils do report the overall position in the same way that we do, and Bedford in particular identifies that they make a report to their General Purposes Committee. It's worth noting, I think, that even if you choose not to receive the information will still be produced. It's produced for a number of purposes, not least for helping the whips to understand what's going on in terms of attendance for their particular group. I know that members were concerned about the quality of the data, and work has been undertaken to make it easier to extract the information from the committee management information system and to ensure that it is more accurate than it has been. So that has been dealt with. So really, my recommendation to you as your monitoring officer would be to continue to receive the information, because I think it is useful both for this committee and for the public to see it in that consolidated form. But of course, it's up to the committee to decide. Thank you, Chair.
Right, so the purpose of this report is, recommendation is to express a view. So have we got any views? Councillor Khan.
Yeah, no, I quite agree with the recommendation that we should continue. It's very important for as a matter of openness and transparency, but at the same time, I would suggest that we may perhaps look at different tools and methods to make the data a bit more readily available at the fingertips, because we're now moving into newer technologies, just ChatGPT, which some of the other councils are looking at, and maybe looking at ways where we can register electronically perhaps, rather than sort of signing manual registers and entering the data manually. This would be much quicker. The technology exists, and as we are moving to either new provider anytime soon, or still even with the current provider, perhaps we could look at new tools.
That is another matter, rather than the reporting of attendance, but I will take it back.
Jackie, go ahead.
Yeah, Ken, it said that on paragraph 6 that changes have recently been made to the way in which the data is captured to make it more efficient and accurate. Can that be explained what it is? Because I have to say, following on from that question, I don't see why we don't move to modern.gov as well. Because if other people are loading the information on there, I don't see why we don't do it. And given the level of the higher level of scrutiny we're under by the public, they can see our attendance straight away. So yeah, if you can answer that, monitoring officer, thank you.
Well, the public can see our attendance by looking on the council's committee management information system. As soon as the attendance sheets are uploaded, that information is available. The problem that we've had in the past is the way that information has been managed in order to produce the consolidated annual report. And it's been done manually. So there's been quite a lot of possibility of error there, and we've seen those errors in this meeting. What has been designed now is an automated way of extracting that information into a way that it can be properly presented in a meaningful way. So for the members of the public who want to see how a particular councillor how their attendance has been, they can do that. They go on to CMIS. And CMIS are there's recently been a procurement exercise, and the current provider of CMIS won that particular tender exercise, so we couldn't change that now in any case. But I think having seen the information that's now being provided, which is available readily, so it can be called on at any time by anybody who's interested, it is definitely a significant improvement on what you've seen in the past.
So Mark, what is the benefit for those councils that use modern.gov? If that could be explained. There must be, I assume there is some benefit.
Well, I can only assume that those were the ones that were chosen to provide their committee management information system through a tendering process.
Okay. John Jones.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It may be of interest to give you a little bit of history of this. When I chaired the Standards Committee, and I'm going back about 15 years, something like this, I was aware that, in fact, the coverage from the press in particular was very limited in terms of reporting on what would appear to be an issue about the standards of commitment of councillors. And so I thought that if it was actually all brought together and produced in an annual report, it would be helpful and they might pick it up. Needless to say, of course, they didn't pick it up, as far as I'm aware. But you're absolutely right. The issue of openness, it would be a shame to lose that, because there's a fundamental principle at stake here. And if, in fact, the reason for no longer publishing it is because there are some question marks about its accuracy, then improve the accuracy, quite frankly, rather than sort of throw the whole thing away. So I would say continue with it. If you've got a more accurate system, a more accurate record, and indeed the councillors take the responsibility for checking that it is accurate, then fine, keep going with it. But I thought that a bit of history might be of assistance to the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Any further questions or comments? Councillor Franks.
I don't have a problem with the current way the information is published, except it is only one measure of the commitment of individual councillors. There are lots of other things that ought to be taken into consideration when you consider whether a member is committed and contributing. Not the least, of course, is the contribution that individual members make when they attend meetings. Simply attending and sitting there not really paying attention to what's going on isn't, to my mind, a significant contribution to the business of the council. It's not a demonstration of the commitment of the member to doing the job. But it's not revealed in the bare statistics. So, sure, let's continue to publish the statistics, but let's not pretend that it's an accurate measure of the commitment of individual members, because it isn't.
Thank you, David, and I think that is somewhat where we started this debate. So, Councillor Steer.
Yeah, I mean, this follows on from Councillor Frank's comments, actually, and your comment of where we started with this. I think the problem is not measuring the data. The problem is, and it's certainly my concern, of what happens, because the data's, it's very raw data, just attendance. And if we remember during the pandemic, we had one member die, unfortunately, of COVID, and another member who was very seriously ill and couldn't attend meetings for a few months, as I recall. And there is no chance to explain why you've not been able to attend meetings, because it's just raw data. And I think that was the starting point of this report and what we wanted to look at and consider.
Mark.
Chair, I would point out to the committee that the raw data is an appendix to the Chair's report.
Yes.
And in the Chair's report, it states very clearly that it is only a measure of one aspect of the work of a councillor. And also, where there are particular circumstances relating to an apparently low rate of attendance, that also is pointed out.
Yes, Mark, we did that example particularly. That was very much outlined in the last report. Do we have any further comments on this matter? Okay, Paula.
I suppose this is the report of this committee. If you don't, if you, what else or what alternative do you want to present in your report, rather than just arguing, not arguing, but discussing how it's done in its current format? But what are the alternatives that are available? What does this committee, the members of this committee, actually want different to what is currently done? It's great to say, could something else be done? But I've not seen any kind of suggestions be made other than maybe individual comments. But what is it that this committee wants to present to the world at large about what members are doing in order to ensure that, you know, the highest possible level of standards are being adhered to in the report, other than attendance at meetings? I fully agree with all the reports of just because someone's here doesn't mean they're actually participating. They'd be asleep in the chair, but they get a tick in a box. What is it that we want to present to the world is kind of the question I would ask. What else is available to measure? What else is available to present in the report that demonstrates the high level of standards that Luton Borough Council is aiming to adhere to?
Councillor Khan.
There's several ways. I mean, I suppose we all look at when we look at outcomes and impacts, and only through work you could see whether a person attends the meetings, makes a valid contribution in terms of influencing and changing policy, but more importantly, making that difference that you initial signed up to do with the residents, which is often quite difficult to measure. But I quite agree. I think we all agree with the recommendation that attendance is one of those markers, which is very, very important. But I think what Councillor Franks is trying to allude to, which I also agree, is that we have many councillors sit here, makes absolutely no contribution whatsoever. They sat there for 2 hours and then they go home. And there's only very few who actually make a contribution. And similarly, you'll find there's not that many who probably do regular surgeries or out there on the doorsteps on a regular basis. So how do you measure that impact? And I think that's something to consider when we're doing these kind of reports before we start sort of questioning someone whether they're effective or not, just based on attendance.
Councillor Bennett.
Yeah, the challenge is really good, I would say, but it goes back to, it's wider than us, the challenge of standards. Yeah, we're looking at the Nolan principles and how people or individuals or society conducts themselves in society is about standards. So we pull from society, and society holds each other to account, or not, as may be the case. So I see that your challenge is a good one, but it goes back to what is the purpose of the Standards Committee, and what level of influence we have in how each party picks their candidates. We can't see the intent of a person's heart, so how do we measure? And attendance is one tangible outcome of whether they turn up. Yeah, but we're not going to measure a person's contribution because we don't know when we part, as my colleagues have said, how effective somebody is. And also, each councillor will have its strengths and its weakness. Some of us are better at certain things than at other, but together we are hopefully holding each other to account and lifting the standard. So I don't think we can really answer it here when we've got people in general, in national government, not being able to hold standards, because it's about leadership.
Apologies, Jackie. We're going to have to take a 10-minute break.
Thank you. Thank you. So I thank you for allowing me to say that, Chair.
Those who wish to do so, feel free to go pray, break fast. If you could please return at past, I would be grateful. last time I looked at the data, apparently Right, is that everyone? Yeah, I think so. So shall we recommence? So, Jackie, I don't know if you had anything further to say before I cut you off. Okay. Did anyone else have any comments? Right, Councillor.
I think I would quite like to see, or that members would have the opportunity to comment on their attendance themselves, particularly if it's low.
So this is before my time, but Mark quite rightly reminds me that in the past members were required to do an annual report on their activities. But when did they stop having to do this?
I honestly can't remember, Chair. It was a long time ago.
Councillor Franks will remember.
I do remember. I'm not afraid to admit that I've been around quite a long time. I do remember the days when members were asked to produce an annual report. Very few did. And the ones who did had virtually nothing of really interest to say. So it gradually faded out. If you're going to reintroduce it, then it might be better to try and do it in a standard format where people simply fill in boxes, because you may then be able to persuade a few more people to actually comply. When it was in operation before, very few people bothered to do it.
Okay. Sorry, did you have a question, Councillor Khan?
I mean, we started that process in the executive, where the executive members had to produce a report at the end of the year with each group at that time. But I'm not sure whether that's continued or not. And again, it's not everyone's cup of tea. It doesn't become a standard process, unfortunately. Some comply and some don't. It's very difficult to push members when they're elected, or they don't even know whether they're going to be elected or not.
Okay, so, yeah.
Just to respond to Councillor Steer's point on the checking of the information, with the new way of extracting the information, which means that it can be done pretty much at the press of a button, it will be possible to circulate the information to members before it's formally reported, so that they can check it, and if they wish to, provide any explanation about low levels of attendance or that sort of thing.
Did anyone have any further comments?
Can I propose that?
Okay, go ahead. So you're proposing what, sorry?
That we allow members, as monitoring officer point out, to see the data before it's published and make any personal comment they wish to on it.
And that would be compiled in the chair's report with the data?
Indeed.
Okay. Would members be happy with that suggestion? Do we need a seconder? Do we need a seconder for that proposal?
It is a formal proposal, so yes.
Can I second it as chair?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine then. Right, so before we move on,
Are we going to vote on it?
that's where I was. So, do we need to vote on that proposal, Mark? Yeah, just a show of hands. If everyone's happy with that proposal, great. I think that is carried. Let me bring back my agenda. My apologies. It would help if I had it open. Okay, so the recommendation was for the committee to express a view on whether or not the reporting of members' attendance at committees should continue to be reported to this committee. The view I'm getting is that everyone still wants the attendance to be reported to this committee. Is that agreed? Okay, so I think we've expressed of you, so therefore do we move on? So shall we move on to the next agenda item, which is on the LGA Model Code of Conduct. So Mark.
Thank you, Chair. This report also picks up on a discussion that took place at the last meeting of the committee, which picked up on an item in the work programme. The question of whether or not to adopt the LGA Model Code of Conduct was considered by the committee in 2022, but it was subsequently decided to put it on hold until we had the May 2023 election had taken place and we had a new batch of members. The difference between Luton's own code of conduct and the LGA model code is really one of style rather than substance. And Appendix A, which compares the provisions in the model code with the provisions in our code, show there is a great deal of similarity between them, and that is what you would expect in codes that are ultimately derived from the same source, which is the principles of public life. The style of the LGA model code is perhaps more accessible. It's written in plainer English. There are explanatory notes, which I think are helpful, both to members and to members of the public. And it just feels a bit less legalistic than our current current code of conduct. So I think for the key question for the committee to consider is that change in style sufficient to justify replacing the code of conduct that most people are familiar with and have been working with for some considerable time. If your view is that yes, that should be considered, then I think we'll need to go to all of the members of the council and gauge their view on whether or not that's something that they would want to see happen. But I have included at Appendix B how Part 1 of the Luton Code of Conduct would look if it were replaced with the LGA Model Code. But I've not slavishly adopted the Model Code because I think the Model Code is particularly weak on the area that deals with the equality duty. And so I've retained the wording that we have in our own Code of Conduct for that particular point. But I've kept the explanatory notes, and at Appendix C you will see the guidance notes that the LGA provide to accompany their model code of conduct, and of course those are really quite handy in being able to delve a little bit more deeply into what the general obligations are. And it's easier to read them if you don't then have to translate them across to the equivalent provision in our own code of conduct. So there's a lot to be said for the LGA model code in terms of its ease of reading. But as I say, is that sufficient to want to make a change? That's obviously for the committee to decide. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. So, Councillor Franks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. I've got a question, first of all. Looking at page 14, at the right-hand column, third box up from the bottom of the page, I comply with any sanction imposed on me following a finding that I have breached the code. I thought we were not allowed to impose sanctions.
There are a number of sanctions still available to Standards Committee under the Localism Act 2011. We saw one of them in operation at November's council meeting, and that is to make a report to the council on the outcome of a local adjudication panel meeting. There are other ones, such as requesting that a group leader remove an offending member from committee places and that sort of thing. But certainly the suspension sanctions that used to be in place were removed.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. That's really helpful. It isn't, therefore, I think, for the individual to comply. You're not required to comply if you're removed from a committee. Okay. The other comment I've got to make about the LGA, so when I'm looking at an application form for a senior position, both in the council and going back to my proper career before I retired, one of the things I did always was to count the number of paragraphs or sentences that began with the word I, because I think that tells you quite a lot about someone. All of these in the LGA version start with the word I. So if we are going to end up adopting it, I would prefer that we found a slightly different way of phrasing that doesn't actually leave the word I as the beginning of every sentence, because it's something that really grates with me, and when it's on a document drafted by an applicant, it tells me quite a lot about the individual.
Mark?
Well, I think that then we would probably end up with the phrasing that is in the current Luton Code of Conduct, which is more impersonal. I think the whole point of the LGA Model Code is that you are intended to own it as an individual member, rather than it being some sort of generic thing that actually applies to somebody over there rather than to me, myself. But it is a very different style, and not that sort of style won't appeal to everyone, certainly.
Councillor,
If I could just say, I am a fan of the plain English approach, and I think it makes it so much easier to understand.
Right, okay. Councillor Khan.
Yeah, no, I agree that language matters, but ultimately it's about the implementation. And the question is the current model or code of conduct working or not? Has there been any gaps identified, or is it just simply the language? And in order to justify replacing it. That's my view. If it's working and that we haven't had any issues, then yes, language, does it matter or does it not matter? That's we'll continue having that debate. But I think if it's being implemented, it's adopted, and people are owning it, then there's no need for change.
Okay. Do you want to come in on that at all? No. Councillor Burnett.
Right, for me, I prefer the LGA to a point, but I don't like the word I do not. It could be worded better that I will. Yeah, there's having done some research on the use of language, you say I will not. Yeah, I will could be a better way of doing things. So people, I do not is very negative. It's like when you're talking to a child, don't do this, don't do that. They usually end up doing what you don't want them to do. So you can rephrase it and say, do something in a different way. I like the I because it's about taking accountability and responsibility. That's just me, and I feel we've had incidents where people do not take personal responsibility for their actions. And by somebody signing, when they become a councillor, to something that they will do, I think that holds them better to what standards we're asking of them. And also, the language is clearer for a member of the public to read and digest. I feel so. That's just me, and I would want, and I think it's a time for us to go engage what Mark was saying, the monitoring officer, with the wider membership. I'm happy for that to do, but we need to do something. Staying with the status quo, I don't think is good enough given the times we're in. And if at the end of the day, in consultation, the collective say, we don't want to go with the LGA, we want to go with Luton, but we want to do some changes, I would rather start that journey. So that's my point. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. I've got Councillor Hussain next.
Councillor Javeria, Chair. I've read the Model Code of Conduct by the LGA, and to me it sounds personable, like I own it, and the language is simple and straightforward. When I look at ours, which is in the Constitution, which is a bit of a long, very long, and sometimes not very easy to navigate document in itself. I think for me the thing would be is that rather than, I agree with what colleagues are saying about change, but for me personally speaking, if the existing one is working, then there's no need to change it. But having said that, for example, there are certain things in the LGA Code of Conduct. For example, if you look at the first item there, it says, I lead by example and act in a way that secures public confidence in the role of a councillor. If you compare that to our existing one, I mean, ours talks about leadership in the authority, but for me, the language for that particular duty, as it were, and the LGA is actually a bit more clearer. So, ordinary people who elect us, our ordinary constituents, understand what is meant by that. So I wouldn't exactly change the Code of Conduct in its entirety, but what I would do is perhaps suggest amendments based on the LGA model where we can clean up the language, because I too am a fan of the Plain English campaign. But I wouldn't go insofar as actually changing it in its entirety. But I would certainly have a stab at making the language a bit more clearer so that, residents of Luton understand what is meant by that Code of Conduct and how it applies to us, and then ultimately can uphold us against it. So that's my view anyway.
Okay. I've got John Jones.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The LGA model, I was not exactly consulted on the version before it was published, but certainly my views were asked for way back. And I have to say the result, I think, is actually quite good, not only because it is easily understood by councillors who are affected by it, but also because, and it hadn't occurred to me actually, that of course members of the public of course have a right to look at this and to see whether in fact they can agree with it. And I think it is easier for them to be able to read it. That's not meant as any criticism of the current code, which on the whole has worked very well for quite a few years, and has not been was based, broadly speaking, on the model which was first published back in 2011. Unlike some other authorities not that far away from here, who have changed it considerably. So I would suggest that actually the LGA model code would be a progressive move and would be also supporting the idea of greater openness and the ability for everybody to understand it.
Next, I had Councillor Petts.
Yes, thank you. I would be interested to know what other councils have adopted this system, and if so, whether they've had any pitfalls or problems with it, or the councillors understanding it, and more importantly, the public understanding it.
The LGA reports that over 50% of local authorities have adopted the LGA Model Code of Conduct in whole or part.
Sorry, what percentage is that?
50%. Now, of course, in whole or in part could mean anything, really. It could mean a little tiny part of it. We ourselves adopted the LGA Model Code of Conduct insofar as it deals with the disclosure the registration and disclosure of interests, and we did that back in 2022. I've not heard of any reports of it being less useful or less effective than any other code of conduct that might be used. They all come from the same source, as I say. They all need to embody the principles of public life. So there is a great deal of commonality between codes of conduct across the board. And I think we just have to really judge for ourselves. If our code of conduct has worked well, then does it need to be replaced? On the other hand, if we can replace it with something that is easier for people to understand and follow and make use of, then, as Councillor Burnett has said, that is a progressive thing to do. As I say, it comes down to a matter of style rather than substance. The substance is the same between the two. There's not a tissue paper that you could put between them, but it is about how it's expressed and how easily it is to understand.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So are we talking in terms of a pick and mix? Would that be a favourable way of going?
Well, that certainly appears to be what's emerging from the discussions of the committee. And as I've already said, I would not adopt the section relating to equalities in the model code because I think it's quite weak. And it's not what we are about as Luton Council. So I think there are bits where we could say, well, actually, we feel that the way we've expressed it, if it was put into that sort of user-friendly style, is better than the LGA bit. And there's no reason why we shouldn't do that.
I had Andrew Maslin.
Yeah, I'm fully supportive of adopting the LGA code because it reads much better and sort of we as independents are here to represent the members of the public and their eyes on this. So I think absolutely it reads better. And I get the point that is the existing code not working, why change it? But I think one area where we really could improve is when we're sat here in assessment panels and adjudication panels, poring over the code line by line, thinking, hang on a minute, how do we interpret that? The LGA code has a line-by-line guide backing it up, which will be enormously helpful in assessment panels and adjudication panels. So for that reason alone, I think we should adopt the code wholesale or wholesale with Mark's changes to the equality section.
I had Jackie.
I was just thinking it might be useful if we do the changes, not just check with colleagues as councillors, but engage with the youth council, give them, hear the views of the next generation as to the use of language, which one is better for them, and give them, is it Mr. Colleague over there, the independent, give them a case and see if they had a case, which one would be easier on its application, and get the feedback. And if we're going to do the change, let's try and do it as robustly as we can. And then we could feed that back in. That could be part of the feedback to us on its application. So we've heard from our council, but we also hear from a group of the next generation, some who may become councillors, and see how and the use of language as well, because language evolve. That's just an idea. It may not be agreeable, but I'm just thinking, how do we bring in different voices and different experience to what we're doing? Thanks.
Would that be something we could do if we were in view of adopting said code?
I don't see why we couldn't do it, Chair. I mean, I can't commit to doing it at the moment because I don't know what the work programme of the Youth Council looks like.
Yeah.
And I think we also have to bear in mind that it's up to the members of the Youth Council to decide what it is that they want to spend their time looking at, but we can certainly make the request.
Right, did we have any more? Councillor Steer.
Thank you. I mean, it comes down to three options, doesn't it? We could keep the Luton Code of Conduct as it is. We could adopt the LGA Code of Conduct as it is. Or I think, as the monitoring officer sort of alluded to earlier, I think the feeling of the board is that we should amend the Luton Code of Conduct to be more like the LGA, but keeping the bits that we value within the Luton version of it. And obviously, I'm aware that gives quite a lot of work to the monitoring officer, but I think that is probably the will of and where we're going.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the opinion in the room seems to be towards LGA keeping certain bits from Luton's and therefore being able to use that accompanying guide. Is that what people... Yes. So, Mark, would you have to go back and look at that?
I think actually the version at Appendix B is probably what you want.
Yeah.
Because it does that. It substantially takes the wording from the LGA model code, but as I say, I've kept the Luton bit in for the equality section.
I know.
So I think that is the version that we would want to put forward for consultation.
So, can I propose that as chair?
Of course.
If I propose that we look at the moving towards the code at Appendix B, which is the LGA's model code with some amendments keeping our old section in terms of equalities, which talks about equalities law. Would anyone want to second that proposal?
I'm happy to second it. Just for clarification, is that the full code or 10 points?
That's part 1 of the code, which deals with the general obligations on conduct. Part 2 of the code has already been adopted into the LGA, into the Luton Code of Conduct.
So what we're proposing is that Appendix B, you have a version of the code that's the LGA code with some amendments by Mark to keep in the equalities section we have in our code. Would people wish to consult on moving to this code of conduct? Can we have a show of hands? I think that's pretty unanimous. So can we move to consulting on that? Perfect. Right, so what's next on my agenda? That's it. Lovely. Right, well, thank you very much for that robust discussion. And with that, I call this part of the meeting to a close. And can those who are sitting on the local